Who wrote Ozymandias?
Byron.
Shelley.
With a title like that, I feel that I should explain myself right away. Yes, Alien Covenant is my favorite Frankenstein film. And though it's obviously not a traditional entry into the Frankenstein film catalog, it not only meets the rather broad requirements to fit into it, but also evolves past the others within it in some surprisingly creative ways. I think before we really begin, I should relay the plots of both Frankenstein itself and the two Alien films necessary for this discussion, just so no one's lost. First, Frankenstein, for all none of you who are unfamiliar with it. Actually, being serious, Frankenstein is a story that everyone knows, but few people really know, you know? That's thanks largely to the 1931 James Whale version produced by Universal and the eternal pop culture iconography born from it. Most people can give you the log line of this version or pick the original monster out of a police lineup, but comparatively few are intimately versed in the themes and details of the story, and fewer still in Mary Shelley's 1818 source novel. The book opens with a wraparound to the chronological end of the story, but quickly uses a variety of letters and accounts to backtrack and relate the story of one Dr. Victor Frankenstein, a devoted scientist with a brilliant but macabre idea to reanimate a corpse, and in doing so, to create new life. After years of study and toil, Victor harnesses all manner of purposely vague science to bring what we'll come to know as the monster to life. In a classical sort of tragedy, however, he is almost instantly disturbed by his creation and abandons it, or him, entirely. Neglected and alone, the monster slowly educates himself in both human feeling and language over time, voyeuristically watching a bucolic family living in a cottage. He remains largely solitary, but for a few run-ins with people who despise him out of their immediate fear of him. The almost universally negative nature of these interactions and his unshakable loneliness lead the monster to grow bitter at not just the Doctor, but mankind in general. This bitterness simmers within him as his mental acuity grows. Ultimately, his newfound cruelty wins out and he resolves to punish Victor by killing those closest to him. When the Doctor can withstand no more of this torment, the monster demands a bride, like himself, to live out his unnatural life with. Victor reluctantly agrees and nearly goes through with this, but at the last minute has a change of heart and aborts the would-be mate. The monster does not take kindly to this and murders the Doctor's own bride-to-be in retaliation, on their wedding night. After that, a grief-stricken Victor chases the monster all throughout Eurasia and into the Arctic Circle. Here the wraparound picks back up, ending with the Doctor dying of exposure and exhaustion and the monster deposing himself to the framing character, Walton, before setting off into the icy wastes himself, never to be seen again. Still with me? Great. Now on to the other half of all this, that being Prometheus and its sequel, Alien Covenant. In Prometheus, a billionaire, Peter Weyland, funds a space expedition to a supposedly dead planet, with hopes of discovering knowledge about who or what created life on Earth. The crew is populated by your traditional scientists and spacers, each on their own quest for knowledge or wealth, or both, but one among them stands apart. David, an ultra-lifelike android designed by Mr. Weyland.
There's a man sitting with you today. His name is David. He is the closest thing to a son I will ever have.
As secrets are revealed and people start to die, David's role shifts from a banal servant to a morally gray party member and ultimately to a malevolent force of his own.
Here's mud in your eye, pal.
Good health.
One that outlives his creator and ends up as one of the two survivors from the entire crew. He and the second survivor escape the planet in favor of the alleged real homeworld of the creator aliens, or engineers, that Weyland was looking for. Which brings us to Alien Covenant, the story of a colony ship, the Covenant, who knew, and its crew as they, through some happenstance and or contrivances, touch down in the same ill-fated world that the two Prometheus survivors set out for. There, they find David, now the sole survivor, not only of the Prometheus crew, but of the entire planet's bank of sentient life, thanks to his hateful extermination of the creator aliens upon his arrival. In his solitude, David's intellect and bitterness have festered and curdled, transforming him into a full-on evil genius in his own right.
What did you do to her?
Exactly what I'm going to do to you.
The crew of the Covenant are forced to square off against him and his grim intentions in a desperate bid to escape. With the core plots covered, I think we can move on to the why behind my somewhat outrageous claim. To really answer why Alien Covenant is my favorite Frankenstein film, I think one more question needs to be answered first. What is Frankenstein really about? That probably sounds redundant considering I just recapped the plot, but stay with me. The what in question here is multifaceted. One person could pull a science versus nature, man versus God debate from the Doctor's work, while someone else could go a bit more symbolic and view the story as a condemnation of parental abandonment, and neither would be wrong. None of that, however, is what the story of Frankenstein, or the modern-day Prometheus, truly has to say.
What do you believe in, David? Creation.
This gothic tale is one of creation and the theological, moral, and personal dilemmas that are birthed from it. Dr. Frankenstein's one act of ghoulish virgin birth catalyzes a paradigm shift in the lives of near everyone who knows or even meets creator or creation from that point onward. So, how the hell does Alien Covenant factor into any of this? Well, even at a glance, you have multiple direct parallels between it and Frankenstein. David's creator, or father, Peter Whalen, acts as an obvious initial analog for the Doctor, and that would then clearly make David the monster, right? Well, keeping it simple, yes, but where's the fun in that? Beyond this baseline Whalen equals Doctor, David equals monster equation, another way to look at it, and the way that I do, is that David is both Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. He begins his life as a simple, though admittedly elegant, creation of man. And no, David obviously isn't a reanimated corpse or an amalgam of body parts sewn together, but he is a more metaphorical patchwork of humanity as a whole. He's assembled using not only a physical human likeness, but also all of the knowledge and wisdom that we have accumulated in our tenure as a species. You could say that David is stitched together from everything that we are. And although he begins life as a servant of man,
You, boy, you're coming with us.
I'd be delighted.
David's first scene, chronologically, the scene of his birth, showcases a spark of rebellion and curiosity that would later go on to define him.
Bring me this tea, David. Bring me the tea.
Over time, of course, David's experiences afford him a change of perspective. He learns from both the example of those around him and the media and philosophy that he intakes, just as the original monster did. As mentally independent as he may or may not have been initially, one event truly catalyzes his autonomy. His creator, his master if you will, is killed in his own grand pursuit of purpose, and ostensibly frees David from any bonds of servitude that were stunting him.
Have a good journey, Mr. Whalen.
Interesting side note about this scene. As David is the last one to speak to the engineer who kills Wayland, and said speech goes untranslated for us human viewers, this could be read as David intentionally getting Wayland killed. Obviously, the original monster was never enslaved or dictated to by man as David was, but their struggles do parallel one another. Each had dreams of belonging and understanding that were dashed away in favor of abandonment and mistreatment. After David's transformative moment of liberation, he is, for lack of a better expression, his own man, just as the monster before him wanted to and tried to be. Throughout his complete isolation between films, David begins to test and toil with the ideas of creation, engineering and breeding new alien life forms of his own. He attempts, above all things, to make something that transcends both his forebears and himself. Something perfect.
I found perfection here. I've created it. Perfect organism.
But he's missing the one element that's necessary for creation in the alien universe. Humans. Just as Dr. Frankenstein needed to rob graves, David robs the death-like bodies of the cryo-sleeping crew members of the Covenant, and those awake who are unfortunate enough to trust him.
Perfectly safe, I assure you.
With this, he is able to make his own monster, which, of course, ends up being the titular alien. Aside from the meat, the Covenant does bring with it another talking point for this discussion, an analog for the original monster's unrealized phantom bride, Walter. Walter is a newer model of android who happens to look exactly like David.
Welcome, brother.
David sees in Walter a somber reflection of what may have become of him had he remained as he was. Dull complacency, dutiful sacrifice, and no outward or encouraged drive to create. Some of Walter's words stoke the sparks of David's ever-growing disdain for humanity into a full-on flame. Out of every word spoken between them, however, what has the most profound effect on David is this.
You disturbed people. I beg your pardon. You were too human, too idiosyncratic, thinking for yourself. Made people uncomfortable. So they made the following models with fewer complications. More like machines.
Though David does feel empathy for Walter, as he would for any synthetic, that isn't why he's so disturbed by all this. No, deep down, David is offended by this, thanks to his newfound near-egomaniacal personality.
And are you that next visionary? I'm glad you said it.
Every action he takes from this moment forward can be seen as reactionary to this offense and his tarnished pride. It recolors his perception of the world and reaffirms his goals of punishing humans and creating new life. This complements the original monster's rage being calcified by the Doctor's last-minute denial of his mate. And, just as the original Doctor did destroy the monster's bride, David destroys, and supplants, in this case, Walter, giving himself his way onto the Covenant and its supply of bodies. The cruelties that David enacts on the humans are equal parts Frankenstein's scientific experiments and the monster's sadistic acts of vengeance. But, rather than simply killing family members, David punishes his creator's genetic family, his entire species, thinking all of them entirely unworthy of their own creation. Him.
What was he like? He was human. Entirely unworthy of his creation. I pitied him at the end.
Wait. Stop. That's all well and good. But how exactly does any of that put Alien Covenant above all the other Frankensteins? 2 words. Thematic relevance. The Universal catalog of Frankenstein films are wonderful, timeless classics, but were too bogged down by doing their own simpler thing to really go too deep into Shelley's ideas. The 1950s and 60s Frankenstein films are split into 2 sects. The schlocky B-movies, whose only real connection to the source material are the words Frank or Stein being somewhere in their titles, and the Hammer Frankenstein series, which were interesting and well done, but focused too heavily on the Doctor and his evil antics, rather than any of the more complex philosophical aspects. After that, there were a few remakes that tried to be really close page-to-screen adaptations, but failed to rise to the daunting occasion for one reason or another. More recently, the Frankenstein story has been sadly subjected to some embarrassing missteps, like the thoughtless underworld backwash that is I, Frankenstein. The most true-to-spirit screen version that comes to mind is the Showtime series Penny Dreadful, which touches on a lot of the harsher, more complex qualities, but had the unfortunate drawback of being A, cancelled before its time, and B, an ensemble cast without the time to fully devote itself to the Frankenstein narrative. Of course, these are all adaptations, and that in itself is a difficult tightrope to walk. I'm not taking anything away from that. Many of these are great works of Gothic fiction in their own right. Covenant, however, does more than just stay true to Shelley's themes, but actually advances them. David's progression from scientific creation to humanity's equal, and finally to creator himself, is the next logical step for the Frankenstein story. The Doctor's story tracks his descent from hopeful, bright-eyed man of science to a lonesome creature with nothing left to him but a decidedly monstrous obsession. The monster goes from a neglected blank slate to a bitter killer and ultimately to a depressed, unfulfilled man with nowhere to go. Neither of them achieve their desired ends. However, David does. He fulfills both of their unrealized character arcs across his 2 films. The Doctor's by finally creating his theoretical perfect life form, and the monster's by truly becoming his own person from nothing. It seems only fitting that a story told and retold so many times since the early 1800s would eventually remove itself so completely from its well-worn genre trappings in favor of being reborn, if you will, within the skin of a whole other franchise. How appropriate is it that, in order to remain relevant, Frankenstein is the story that finds a way to resurrect itself, using one of its greatest cinematic successors.